For those of you who don't know, Flutter is a framework using which you can build mobile applications. So in today's topic, I will be discussing few UI fundamentals. So it is for beginners and also for some intermediates. So if you're new to Flutter or if you have not heard of it, you don't have to worry because this is going to cover most of the basics. So before I begin talking about the UI fundamentals, let me introduce myself. So I'm a Google developer expert for Flutter, and I'm also a Women Techmakers ambassador. So both these programs are by Google. And I'm also one of the organizers in Flutter Abu Dhabi and Dubai. So Flutter Abu Dhabi and Dubai is an official meetup network for UAE. So we try to have once in every month or once in 2 months events where Flutter developers or just developers from all over the UAE, we come together, network, we share our knowledge, and we even talk about some interesting topics. And if you're interested to know more about it, you can reach out to me and I'll tell you how you can also become a part. And apart from that, I'm also a blogger. The way I share my knowledge is by blogging. I love blogging. I love sharing my knowledge. And with all of this, I'm a full-time developer. So I'm a Flutter developer, and that's my full-time role. So the agenda for today is very simple. We'll start with the importance of UI and UX. And after that, we will discuss about three categories, which is routing, animation, state management. So these three categories, it will build up the UI and UX and what role they play in UI UX. And then I'll share with you some examples of project folder structure. And finally, we will just wind up with some key points. So importance of UI and UX. So I have some screens here. So I'm just trying to compare with animation and without animation. So if you see the loading screen there, the loading icon, you will notice that the one with the animation, it's a little more detailed. And the one without animation, it's just a circular progress indicator. And what it does is, it's a very simple icon, I can say. And when we try to compare both of them, I'm sure the one with the animation makes much more sense. And then we have some grid tiles here. So notice that the one without the animation, you just click on it and then it changes the value. But the one with the animation, when you try to click on it, it has a certain effect, like a bounce effect. So these simple things, when you try to add it to your application, it will make it much more attractive and more engaging to the user. So the next one is, so if you see the GIF here, what it does is, now, can someone tell me what is happening there in that screen just by looking at the icon and what animation it is doing? Any ideas? Yes, exactly. So now there is nothing on the screen. There is no text. Nothing is happening. There is just a GIF. And with the help of this GIF, you all guessed it right. The user is sending a message and the response is this GIF. It means that the message has been successfully sent. So this way, animations are more like they speak with the user. In an application, when you try to add animations, it speaks to the user. So that is the importance of animations in UI UX. And when so like out of personal experience, when I use an application, I expect it to have some good UI. And the reason is because good UI always attracts the users. And along with that, if I open an application and it has good UI, but not UX. So UX is nothing but user experience. So if I'm using an application with good UI, everything is fine. I have all the text fields, everything is well, but the UX is not good. So it's like when I try to log in, there is no, at the background, there is no internet, but it's not saying anything. It's just stuck on that screen. So what happens is, I don't know what's happening, but in the background, there is no internet. So these things, if you're also coming across a certain scenario, add animations or something like snack bars and tell the user that, no, there is no internet right now, so try again later. So these are the simple UI UX things that you can incorporate in the app and which will make it much more engaging. So the other one would be ensure responsiveness. So let's say if you're building an application for web, mobile, and even tablet, responsiveness is a major factor. Because let's say that my application is running very well in the web, but in the mobile, sorry, it's running very well in the mobile. But when I try to resize the screen in the web, it's not responsive. So obviously, that is not a good thing. The users will get discouraged when they use certain applications like that. And these are some of the UI do's and don'ts. So over the years, I have collected few tips and tricks, I can say, which I keep sharing on my blog, and some of it I'll share it here. So whenever you're building an application, always make sure that you use minimal packages. And the reason is because sometimes, so Flutter has updates like it's like we have very frequent updates, right? So that also means that when you're building packages, your package has to be up to date with the new update. Because if it is not updated as per the update, then it's going to break. Your app is going to break. So for that reason, try to use minimal packages. And by that I mean, let's say I'm adding some application, some animation to a container. Now, when you visit pub.dev, there are so many packages just for animations. So there can be one like Flutter animation, the basic one that covers all the animations. And there are some other packages like animated container, which is dedicated only to the container. Now, in my application, if I'm using animations in like most of the places, obviously I'll go with the first one, right? Because I'll have more options. So there is no point to use the second package then, which is just animated container. So if you're also building something like that, avoid using animated container because the same thing you can achieve using the other package. So in this way, you can make sure that you're using minimal packages. The second one would be to keep your pubspec.yaml updated. So pubspec.yaml is a file where we add all of the packages with the versions. So always ensure that your pubspec.yaml is updated. Again, if it's not, if your packages are not up to date, but the Flutter version that you're using is up to date, then your app can break. Like the similar thing happened when Flutter migrated to null safety. Not all of the packages are still migrated to null safety. So what happened is, if I'm using a package that doesn't support null safety on Flutter 3, then my app will break. So what happens is, in such a case, you'll have to look for an alternative. Now, if I had not used the package, the one that doesn't have null safety support, and I came up with my own solution, then what would happen is I can still go on and I don't have to depend on any packages. The last one is, the third one is my personal favorite. It's called customized repeating widgets. So here I have an elevated button code. Now, let's say buttons are very common in an application, right? So let's say I'm using this elevated button in multiple places in the application, let's say like 10 to 15 places. So what I have to do is I have to copy paste the same code again and again, like 10, 15 places. And let's say I want to change the text style. I want to change the font size from 18 to 22. And I want all of the elevated buttons to have the same font size. So what will happen is you have to change in 10, 15 places, which isn't very ideal. So if you're working on a bigger application, then it will be more number of times. So a possible solution to this would be to customize that widget. Now, elevated button is one widget. What I can do is I can extract that widget and call it as a common button. Now, this common button is the widget that I'll be using in those 10, 15 places. And if I have even a single change, like a font style change, I only have to change it here. I don't have to change in all the places. And the way I will use it in my UI is I will just call it as common button and then pass three dynamic values. So the dynamic values are like, so if I have a button in 10, 15 places, obviously not all of them will do the same thing, right? Different screens will have, I'll need different color, and maybe I'll need a different on press property. That is, when I click on it, it will do something. So what we can do is we can make these as dynamic values, the on press, color, and text. So the first button, when I click on it, it's going to lock the text light purple button was clicked. For second, it will be deep purple button was clicked. In this way, you can have different on-press values or functionality. And even color of the button, you can change it like that. And obviously, when you're having the button in 10, 15 screens, everyone will have different text like login or submit. So this value here is dynamic and you can pass any text value to the button. So this is way you can make the widgets common if they're appearing in more than one places. So the next one would be, so avoid using print in production ready code. And the reason is because, so when I use a print statement, what does it do? It just prints something in the debug console so that I know, like if I'm debugging, this is very useful. But I have personally stopped using print because print can sometimes in production ready code, it can lock some sensitive information, which isn't very ideal, right? So we can use something called as log. Log will do exactly the same, but it is not going to log out sensitive information. So in the same way, I can use the log and it is going to print messages in the debug console. The other one would be Flutter lints. So now if your Flutter framework is up to date, and if you try to create a new program, you're going to find Flutter underscore lints in pubspec.yaml. And this particular package, what it does is it's going to look for errors, and not errors, but more like warnings. So the image here, so these problems or warnings are by Flutter lints. So it's going to tell you that in my code, if I haven't used the word const, it's going to throw a warning and say, use the keyword const. And similar things like that. And always try to resolve these warnings. It's not going to break your code. If it breaks your code, then it means it was a useful warning. But when you're pushing your code to production, it's always better to resolve these errors and then make the push. Because essentially, this, if you ever use print, it is always going to be printed here as a warning. The other one, so next tip, what I can say is that will help in the UI is having a common constants file. Now, this constant file is going to have all the constant values that I'll be using in my application. Now, let's say I have a color. In my entire application, I'm going to use a same color for the text. So what I will do is I can have a file like constants.dart, and there I can write this color statement. Then what I can do is just import this file and use the text color anywhere in the application. Similar thing goes for if I want some empty containers of height 25, just use a sized box with height 25. And if you want like an invisible container, just call it as sized box with height 0. So this is another tip which I'll be sharing later. And also also naming your assets. This is where I name my assets, and also textiles. So box decoration, textiles, common app bars, all of these things, we can put it in a common file.
Don't we have to put these assets in the PubSpec file?
No, that is when you'll be registering it with the application. But when you're using that asset file, you need to name it, right? Otherwise, what I will do is image.asset, and in the bracket, I have to write this entire thing, that is asset slash images slash logo.png. But let's say I'm using the same image in 10 places. All of the time, I'll have to write asset slash images slash logo.png. Instead, what I can do is image.asset, just logo, because this logo is exactly the whole string. So instead of writing the string, just use the variable.
Because like you have to first load it in the HubSpot.yaml and you want to use it.
Yeah, that is there. That is a completely different step. So this step is only going to eliminate you using the string, but the pubspecs.yaml step is always going to be there. So this is the invisible widget that I was talking about. Now, in the screen here, when I click on the light purple button, you're going to view a text, right? But if I click it again, the text is going to disappear. Now, how am I doing this? There are multiple ways of doing this. Two of the ways would be first one using a ternary operator, that is the show button, the first code, and the next one will be using a visibility widget. Now, the way I do it is I use a ternary operator. Now, show button is like a variable, it's a Boolean variable. Whenever show button is true, the text, that is light purple text, will be seen on the screen. And whenever it is false, it's going to be an invisible widget. That is the height 0 is exactly sized box with height 0. Now, when I click on the light purple button, show button variable is true, and that's why you're able to see light purple text. When I click on it again, I'm going to make show button as false. And that's the reason you're seeing there an invisible container. That is, it's just empty there. The other one would be the other way to do it is using the visibility widget. Now, visibility widget will have a value called visible. So if the visible is true, you can see the text, and if it is false, you don't see anything. So the entire visibility widget will be invisible. And the child is obviously the text that you want to add. And when you're using the ternary operator, make sure you don't use any null value. Just try as much to avoid null values in the application. So instead of using the null value, you can just add it as height 0. That's the reason I'm using height 0, because I want to avoid null values. So I'm sure we all have come across the maroon color screen, that the red color screen. Whenever your application runs into an error, or like runtime error or any kind of error, you're going to see the red color screen. I have come across it many times. Now, what happens is this red color screen, if your app is in production, what I have noticed is I don't see the red color screen, but it just becomes like a blank screen.
Like gray.
Yeah, and it doesn't do anything. The app becomes stuck at that point. So it's not very ideal, right? I mean, you need to tell your user what is happening, because that is what UX is. So what we can do is we can use a package called Catcher. Now, Catcher, what it does is it will tell that whenever your program has encountered this kind of error, you can write a custom message and tell your user that an application error has occurred. So in this way, even the user won't be thinking that why is my screen stuck. User will instead know, okay, there has been some error, and that I need to maybe check for the internet connection. Also, this message can be a custom message. You can have it as just text, or you can even have a snack bar, so you can add your own message there. So if it's like an internet connectivity issue, you can tell, please check your internet connection, or anything. Even if it's like values, then you can, all of that, you can tell it in the message there. And one of the benefits of using the Catcher package is you can have your own custom message. So if there are like 10 scenarios where your program could break, or your API could handle 10 errors, then you can add custom messages there. And obviously the solution to this is to test your app thoroughly. That is one stage that you shouldn't miss. But even after testing, if the app is going to fail at some point, that is when you can use Catcher. Okay, so those were all the do's and don'ts that I have encountered over the years and that I have shared. So the next one is routing. Now, when we talk about better UI and UX, routing is one of the key features because you need to have a proper routing structure in your application. Now, if it is a small application, you can totally maybe let it go. But if it is a complex application, it's always better to have a routing structure. And there are certain packages for this, like AutoRoute, there is Go Router, and there's also Beamer. The one that I prefer the most is the AutoRoute because it's always worked out well for me. And so, for those of you who are thinking, what is routing? Routing is like when your application, you click on a button or anything, the routing goes from your app goes from one screen to other. That is basically routing. And the screens, pages are all called as routes. So I have one widget, let's call it as first screen. That is my home page. And when I click on something in first screen, the control goes to the second screen. So first screen and second screen are called as routes. And in auto route, what we do is we are going to register the routes. Now, if I don't use auto route or if I don't use any routing structure, what happens is I'll have to write all of these lines, that is navigator.push, material page route, context, builder, all of that, and then give the name to my widget. But this isn't very ideal when you're working on bigger applications, right? You're just going from one screen to other is going to have so many lines of code. And what I can do is I can register in auto route. What I can do is I can register the routes. So the second route that you see here, I can register it and give it a name. That is like slash second. So I can say navigator.push name. Okay, navigator.push name context slash hash second. So this is basically again navigator, but I'm pushing it to a named screen. And what is the named screen? Slash second here. So let me talk a little bit about AutoRoute. Now, the reason why I like to use AutoRoute in bigger applications is because it supports deep linking. That means I can go from one screen to the 10th screen in a row. So this is something I can do. And then there is also something called as guarded routes. Now, let's say you're building an e-commerce application and or e-commerce or it could be any application but with authentication. Now, what you would want is only the authorized users or the logged in users can enter, let's say, the cart. Okay, so you have saved some items in your cart, and if you want to view those items, you have to be an authorized user, right? So what we can do in such cases is if you have, let's say, a widget that you only want authorized users to see, you can guard that route. That means not everyone can enter that route. Only people who are authorized can enter. So this is one of the things which is one of the key features which is possible with AutoRoute. And obviously, we will have clean routing setup because everything, all of the routes will be registered in one screen, in one file. The the auth cards that I said. Now, how will your application know which is an authorized user and who is not authorized, right? So whenever the user is logging into the application, I'm going to save a token. That token, that will be saved securely in the application. And what happens is during routing, let's say the page that I want to secure is called first screen. Okay. Now, when I enter first screen, since it is guarded, what will happen is I'm going to call a function called get user token. So it's going to check if the token is there, then only that person can enter that screen, which is first screen. However, if the token does not exist, that means he is not logged in and he is unauthorized. So I will just push him back to some other screen, let's say login screen, and ask him to log in. So this is one feature which really helps in auto route.
Right, so what if that, so what if you just installed the app like a new user? Like, how would you detect if it's a new user?
Because a new user's token will be deleted. Like when he logs out, it's going to get deleted.
Like when he first logs in, like, how do you know if this is a new user or this is an existing user?
Because let's say I have downloaded the application and so I have come to first screen. Now I know that the user, there is no token. So that is when he will be pushed to the login screen. Because when I download the application, when I'm a new user, there is no token, right? So it is going to check for the token. And since there is no token, you will be directed back to login screen. But let's say I have logged in and now I close the application. I open it again. I check for the token. Now the token is there when I last logged in. So that's how it checks. So there is a variable where it saves the token. So the next one is animations. So animations, as we discussed earlier, always a good idea to add animations to your app because it makes the app more engaging. Because when a user downloads an application, you don't communicate with the user. It is your app that communicates with the user, right? So adding good animations is obviously going to make the user more engaged with the application. And without extra effort, like without having to tell what is actually happening, I'll just present this GIF whenever I come across certain scenario. So it's also going to save up widgets and lots of effort. The other screen that we have, it's actually the Reflectly app. If you haven't heard of this app, I think you should try it out. It has really good animations. So another factor that really contributes in good UI UX is state management. So state management, I'm sure whoever here works with Flutter knows how important it is. It's always important to select the right state management.
Or the stateless and state?
No, something like block. So it's more like the app architecture. And the reason why I would say that is because let's say I'm building an app and 10 people are working on it. So you need to have a well-structured app so that if I'm 11th person entering the project, I know where is exactly what. I know which is UI. I know which is the where I have to add the new APIs. Where is the model? So in that way, it's always a good idea to have a well-structured app. Separate the UIs into one folder. Separate the repositories, services into one folder, constants into one file, so that it becomes easier for collaborative work. When a new person joins the team, it becomes easier for them to understand rather than having everything in one or two folders. So one thing that I was always told was to separate the business logic from the UI. Now, this is extremely useful when you're building like complex applications that does a lot of logic work. So my UI, your UI should always be the UI widgets. It shouldn't have any logic involved. And the reason is because it's going to complicate things when as your UI grows, as your widget grows. If you have more of logic in the UI, it's going to complicate things. That's why in the state management, we have something called as block. So for example, I'll talk about block today. So in block, all of the logic, so block itself stands for business logic component. UI, since it is completely separated, I'm going to add all the logic inside block so that everything will be handled by the block and the UI shouldn't handle any logic. It should only and only be widgets that display in the UI. So always separate the UI from the logic. So UI here is the view, and the logic should be the block. So the block, models, and repository. So it's more like from the UI, if I click on the login button, so what happens is the email password will be passed to the API. API is going to then be called, and the response will again come back to the UI, right? So that's when you're going to later be logged in. Now, all of the API calls should never be in the UI. It should always be in the logic, which is either block, models, or repository. Block is where you can add the calls to API. Models is where you're going to store the data, and repository are the actual API calls. So this is one of the folder structures that I follow. In my main library, I'm going to have a folder called logic and another folder called views. So logic is going to have the blocks, the models, and the repositories. And views is going to be just the UI. There is no logic. Logic will be completely be handled by the logic folder. Views is just plain UI and call to the blocks, call to the logics. And I hope you've at least learned some practices on UI and how important UI UX is for an application. And if you haven't tried any routing structure till now, I really encourage you to try. You can start with AutoRoute. I feel that AutoRoute is a little easier when compared to others, and you don't have to do a lot of work because AutoRoute uses code generator. So code generator does or writes more of the code, and you just have to write very little code and add animations wherever you can. And managing states is again very important. And yeah, the project folder structure. So those are all that we've learned today. And yeah, thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Another question, like as you mentioned, animation obviously helps with improving the UI, but like how do you find the balance between UX and UI? So like you have animations, but especially when you're working with Android, you could have like systems which have very low performance. So like, do you limit
Yes.
animations on devices with lower performance?
So what I would say is if it's a simple app, you can avoid it. But if you're building a much complex app, you can at least add like some basic UI maybe, like for example, the email, like what I showed. And one thing what you can note is try to avoid box shadow because box shadow is the one that's going to take up more time. So that is one thing that I can say.
Just one more question.
Sure.
Do you ever go back to management for clients depending like company you work with? To say that this kind of animation might take up a lot of resources
Mm-hmm.
and never like go back and tell them what to do. Just
Yes, obviously. You can give the advice saying that this is your requirement, but this is going to take up more resources. So I have an alternate solution. Or maybe, yeah, you can say something like this is the alternate solution. Or if you feel that the requirement is a little too high and takes up most of the resources, it's better to omit it then, I would say.
I have an experience with Flutter. I had an app where it had some features out there and a lot of pages.
Mhm.
But the problem is with lower end devices, it did not work properly. So like, how do you manage with lower end devices, even though it has no animations or
Lower end, as in like any model specifically, or like SDK version?
any models, any coding? Yeah, both.
Um, I personally, I haven't encountered that. But one thing that I've encountered is for the Android 12. Android 12 does ask for some extra changes in the Android manifest file. So, yes, you can test with multiple devices, and whenever you come across the error, just try to fix it as much as you can. So, for your question, I would say is test on all of the devices. And obviously, if something is not working, you should just look for an alternate solution.
But I did test it on other devices. Yeah,
Okay.
it seemed a lot slower. Like this, like, I have my phone right here, and like when loading it,
Mhm.
it felt really slow.
Okay.
Yeah, so like, how do you fix that?
I would say if it is happening only on one or two devices, then maybe you'll have to check for the frame per rates of that device, because sometimes some mobiles, some devices, what happens is it cannot take up more animation because it depends on the frames per rate of the device also. So I would, maybe for some devices it happens, but if it works for most of the devices, then I think you should go ahead with that, or maybe find an alternate solution with little bit less resolution.
So I haven't used Flutter personally, but I do know that you can use it to build cross-platform apps.
Right.
So can you use the same business logic and maybe separate your UI for different design systems, or do you need to replicate both? So maybe have one folder just for Android, one just for iOS.
You mean to say you want to build an application but different for Android and different UI for iOS?
Not different, but like Apple has their design system, so they need to use certain sizes.
Not
No?
really. Like you can use the same for both Android and iOS.
Okay.
And if you want to separate it, again, you can use the ternary operator and check if platform is Android, then go ahead with this design. If it is iOS, go ahead with the other design.
But you don't need to separate. You don't need separate folders.
No, you don't need separate folders because essentially the compiler it will be the same for both. So it compiles the same way. Any other questions? Anyone? Thank you. Thank you.
The Wall of Fame,
Oh.
LinkedIn, everybody wants to